Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the coronavirus pandemic and the EU single market.
As more and more European countries went into lockdown, trade within the EU and the foundations of its single market were hit hard.
The EU was quick to respond, but the effects of the pandemic on both European and world economies will be deep and long-lasting. Want to know more? Stay with us.
With its 450 million consumers, the EU prides itself on being the largest integrated market in the world, worth 14 trillion euros in 2018.
By removing barriers to trade, safeguarding fair competition, attracting investment and boosting efficiency and economies of scale, the single market is, without a doubt, one of the EU's greatest successes.
Through its tightly knit network of supply chains, financial connections and trade relationships, it is responsible for 2/3 of the EU's total trade in goods. But the coronavirus pandemic, which engulfed the entire world in the spring of 2020, shook its very foundations and caused the deepest economic contraction in living memory,
making the figures of the global financial and economic crisis of 2008 pale in comparison. Back then, EU GDP shrunk by 2.5% in the first quarter of 2009 compared to the previous quarter. In 2020, EU GDP plummeted by 3.5% in the first quarter only.
And that's not all. With consumers locked in their homes and supply chains disrupted, production decreased by almost 28%, and according to the world's leading financial institutions, recovery is still uncertain.
It is. In its most optimistic scenario, the IMF predicts a contraction of 7.1% in EU GDP in 2020, followed by a rebound of 4.8% in 2021, which would leave the economy way below its pre-virus levels.
But a longer-lasting outbreak in 2020, a second wave in 2021, or a combination of the two, would trigger a much worse scenario with up to 8% of additional GDP loss in the advanced economies.
Now let's look at the impacts of COVID-19 on the single market in greater detail.
The pandemic seriously disrupted the free movement of people, goods and services across the EU, which are the pillars of the single market. As member states reintroduced internal border controls to prevent the spread of the disease, air and road freight transport also slowed down across Europe.
Border closures and wider confinement measures disrupted labour mobility and supply chains inside and outside Europe, forced businesses to close down and caused millions of workers to lose their jobs. And the fear is that some companies and supply chains may never reopen, causing parts of the market to disappear completely.
And while the depth of the economic downturn and the strength of recovery vary across EU member states, many of those that were hardest hit by the pandemic, such as Italy and Spain, happen to have the least policy space to respond to it, as they still have not fully recovered from the previous crisis. Furthermore, their economies depend on the tourism sector, which faces a difficult summer ahead.
If the EU doesn't take decisive action to help these countries, an uneven recovery risks creating even more divergences, fragmentation and permanent damage to the single market, which will have a negative impact on the EU's recovery as a whole.
Experts agree the unravelling of the single market or parts of it could have disastrous economic effects, estimated at between 3 and 8.7% of EU GDP, or between 480 billion euros and 1.38 billion euros annually. So what does the EU plan to do?
The EU has acted on many fronts since the crisis struck. Initially, it provided first response measures to avoid a complete economic paralysis, but it has also developed a more comprehensive, longer-term response to put the European economy back on its feet and repair the damage inflicted by the crisis, while at the same time protecting and deepening the single market and rendering it more autonomous.
Among the initial measures was the setting up of green lanes to keep essential goods and services flowing between and across member states. Without these measures, European citizens would have had a hard time finding food or getting the necessary medicines.
To keep things moving, the EU has also had to guarantee the free movement of critical workers, such as seafarers and truck drivers, but also seasonal workers and others, and it boosted production of medical devices, medical products and protective equipment.
Once the medical emergency looked somewhat under control, the Commission started planning a coordinated return to normality, if one can use this word, drafting the way forward for Member States to gradually lift containment measures, restore the freedom of movement and allow citizens to travel again within the EU.
To cushion the blow to people's livelihoods and the economy, EU leaders agreed on a €540 billion package consisting of 3 safety nets. A €100 billion safety net to support workers via the European Commission's new instrument SURE, an up to €200 billion pan-European guarantee fund for loans to companies through the European Investment Bank, and another €240 billion to support member states via the European Stability Mechanism.
The EU also took swift action to redirect EU funds to help member states deal with the effects of the corona crisis. It has applied the full flexibility of its fiscal rules to help governments to support healthcare systems and businesses, and it has relaxed its state aid rules so that governments can provide liquidity to the economy.
Apart from these measures, steps have also been taken to address specific challenges in crucial economic areas such as tourism, agriculture and fisheries. But the EU will need a real Marshall Plan to come out of this crisis and regain its strength.
Yes, and the answer may be Next Generation EU. Stay with us.
The new recovery instrument proposed by the Commission will reinforce the EU budget with additional funding of up to €750 billion raised by the Commission on financial markets. The Commission also proposes to refocus its long-term EU budget of €1,100 billion so that it channels investments to where they are most needed.
The plan aims to address the damage caused by the pandemic and turn the crisis into an opportunity to invest in a green, digital, social and more resilient EU.
Investing in better connectivity and advancing the digital single market will help boost the EU's strategic autonomy and reduce dependency from foreign players. Investing in green energy projects or sustainable agriculture will help the EU achieve its climate and sustainability targets.
So the Commission is presenting the recovery plan as a win-win for all, but how do other EU institutions see it?
Some think tanks and experts warn that the proposed recovery plan, while a step in the right direction, may be financially insufficient and too slow to disburse. The European Parliament has asked for a major recovery package worth €2 trillion.
MEPs believe such a financial effort is needed to transform the EU economy and boost its resilience, with investments that focus on supporting SMEs, creating more jobs and giving citizens the right skills for the future.
Negotiations on this complex recovery plan have already begun, and hopes are for an agreement by mid-July, when EU leaders will meet face-to-face for the first time in months, to try to secure a compromise on this new European Marshall Plan.
You're listening to European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.